Good morning, philosophers. Let's continue. Listen, and let me show you the sorry consequences to which subtlety carried too far can lead, and what an enemy is, and what an enemy it is to truth. Protagoras declares that it is possible to argue either side of any question with equal force, even the question whether or not one can equally argue either side of any question. Nausiphanes declares that of the things which appear to us to exist, none exists any more than it does not exist. Parmenides declares that all these phenomena, none exist except the whole. Zeno of Elea has dismissed all such difficulties by introducing another. He declares that nothing exists. The Phaeronian, Megarian, Etrian, and academic schools pursue more or less similar lines. The last named have introduced a new branch of knowledge, non-knowledge. Well, all these theories you should just toss on top of the heap of superfluous liberal studies. The people I first mentioned provide me with knowledge which is not going to be of any use to me, while the others snatch away from me any hopes of ever acquiring any knowledge at all. Superfluous knowledge would be preferable to no knowledge. One side offers me no guiding light to direct my vision towards the truth, while the other just gouges my eyes out. If I believe Protagoras, there is nothing certain in the universe. If I believe Nausiphanes, there is just the one certainty, that nothing is certain. If Parmenides, only one thing exists. If Zeno, not even one. Then what are we? The things that surround us, the things on which we live, what are they? Our whole universe is no more than a semblance of reality, perhaps a deceptive semblance, perhaps one without substance altogether. I should find it difficult to say which of these people annoy me most. Those who would have us know nothing, or the ones who refuse even to leave us the small satisfaction of knowing that we know nothing. Letter... Oh man. Brain is blanking on Roman numerals again. Hold on. What is C? I'm terrible. I recognize that I'm terrible. C is 100. Okay. So XC is 100 minus 10, so 90. Okay. We're on letter 90. Who can doubt, my dear Lucilius, that life is the gift of the immortal gods, but that living well is the gift of philosophy? A corollary of this would be the certain conclusion that our debt to philosophy is greater than the debt we owe to the gods, by just so much as a good life is more of a blessing than simply life. Had it not been for the fact that philosophy itself was something bestowed by the gods, they have given no one the present of a knowledge of philosophy, but everyone the means of acquiring it. For, if they had made philosophy a blessing given to all and sundry, if we were born in a state of moral enlightenment, wisdom would have been deprived of the best thing about her, that she isn't one of the things which fortune either gives us or doesn't. As things are, there is about wisdom a nobility and magnificence in the fact that she doesn't just fall to a person's lot, that each man owes her to his own efforts, that one doesn't go to anyone other than oneself to find her. What would you have worth looking up to in philosophy if she were handed out free? Philosophy has the single task of discovering the truth about the divine and human worlds. The religious conscience, the sense of duty, justice, and all the rest of the close-knit, interdependent company of virtues never leave her side. Philosophy has taught men to worship what is divine, to love what is human, telling us that with the gods belongs authority and among human beings fellowship. That fellowship lasted for a long time intact, before men's greed broke society up and impoverished even those she had brought most riches. For people cease to possess everything as soon as they want everything for themselves. The first men on this earth, however, and their immediate descendants followed nature unspoiled. They took a single person as their leader and their law, freely submitting to the decisions of an individual of superior merit. It is nature's way to subordinate the worst to the better. With dumb animals, indeed, the ones who dominate the group are either the biggest or the fiercest. The bull who leads the herd is not the weakling, but the one whose bulk and brawn has brought it victory over the other males. In a herd of elephants, the tallest is the leader. Among human beings, the highest merit means the highest position. So they used to choose their ruler for his character. Hence people were supremely fortunate when among them a man could never be more powerful than others unless he was a better man than they were. For there is nothing dangerous in a man's having as much power as he likes, if he takes the view that he has power to do only what it is his duty to do. Interesting that, no ruler was not on the menu of things considered here. Also, like most rulers are in his history have been determined by bloodline, right? Not by merit. In that age, then, which people commonly refer to as the Golden Age, government, so Posidonius maintains, Posidonius? Let's go with that, was in the hands of the wise. They kept the peace, protected the weaker from the stronger, urged and dissuaded, pointed out what was advantageous and what was not. Their ability to look ahead ensured that their peoples never went short of anything, whilst their bravery averted dangers and their devotedness brought well-being and prosperity to their subjects. To govern was to serve, not to rule. No one used to try out the extent of his power over those to whom he owed that power in the first place, and no one had either reason or inclination to perpetrate injustice, since people governing well were equally well obeyed, and a king could issue no greater threat to disobedient subjects than that of his own abdication. But with the gradual infiltration of the vices and the resultant transformation of kingships into tyrannies, the need arose for laws which were themselves, to begin with, drafted by the wise. Solon, who established Athens as a democratic state, was one of the 7 men of antiquity celebrated for their wisdom. If the same age had produced Lycurgus, an 8th name would have been added to that revered number. The laws of Zaleucus and Chirondas are still admired. And it was not in public life or in the chambers of lawyers that these 2 men learnt the constitutional principles which they were to establish in Sicily, then in its heyday, and throughout the Greek areas of Italy, but in the secret retreat now hallowed and famous of Pythagoras. Thus far I agree with Posidonius. But that philosophy discovered the techniques employed in everyday life that I refuse to admit. I will not claim for philosophy a fame that belongs to technology. It was philosophy, says Posidonius, that taught men how to raise buildings at a time when they were widely dispersed and their shelter consisted of huts or burrowed-out cliffs or hollowed tree trunks. I, for my part, cannot believe that philosophy was responsible for the invention of these modern feats of engineering that rise up story after story, or the cities of today crowding one against the next, any more than of our fish tanks, those enclosures designed to save men's gluttony from having to run the risk of storms and to ensure extravagant safe harbors of their own. However wildly the high seas may be raging, in which to fatten separately the different kinds of fish. Are you really going to tell me that philosophy taught the world to use keys and bolts on doors, which was surely nothing but a signal for greed? Was it philosophy that reared the towering buildings we know today, with all the danger they mean to the people living in them? It was not enough, presumably, for man to avail himself of whatever cover came to hand, to have found a shelter of some kind or other in nature, without trouble and without the use of skills. Believe me, that age before there ever existed architects or builders was a happy age. The squaring off of timbers, the accurate cutting of beams with a saw that travels along a marked out line, all these things came in with extravagance. The first of men with wedges split their wood. Oh, I think that was a poem quote. Let me check. Yeah. Yes, for they were not preparing a roof for a future banqueting hall, and pines or firs were not continually being drawn through streets trembling at their passage on a long convoy of vehicles to support paneled ceilings heavy with gold. Their huts were held up by a forked pole stood at either end, and with those close-packed branches and a sloping pile of leaves, a runoff was arranged for even heavy rains. This was the kind of roof under which they lived, and yet their lives were free of care. For men in a state of freedom had thatch for their shelter, while slavery dwells beneath marble and gold. Interesting. Another matter on which I disagree with... Hold on. Let me read that again. Their huts were held up by a forked pole stood at either end, and with close-packed branches and a sloping pile of leaves, a runoff was arranged for even heavy rains. This was the kind of roof under which they lived, and yet their lives were free of care. For men in a state of freedom had thatch for their shelter, while slavery dwells beneath marble and gold. Interesting. There's some parallels we might be able to make to that today with the discussions that we've been having about getting out of the city, right? Getting rid of modern conveniences in an effort to locate oneself in a state of more freedom. Another matter on which I disagree with Posidonius is his belief that it was by wise men that tools were originally invented. On that sort of basis, there is nothing to stop him saying that it was by philosophers that, quote, discovered next were ways of snaring game, of catching birds with lime, of setting dogs, all round deep woods, end quote. It was human ingenuity, not wisdom, which discovered all that. I disagree with him again where he maintains that it was wise men who discovered iron and copper mining. When the earth had been scorched by a forest fire and had melted to produce a flow from surface veins of ore. The person who discovers that sort of thing is the kind of person who makes it his business to be interested in just that sort of thing. Nor, for that matter, do I find it as nice a question as Posidonius does, whether the hammer started to come into general use before the tongs or the other way around. They were both invented by some individual of an alert, perceptive turn of mind, but not one with the qualities of greatness or of inspiration. And the same applies to anything else the quest of which involves a bent back and an earthward gaze. The wise men then followed a simple way of life, which is hardly surprising when you consider how even in this modern age he seeks to be as little encumbered as he possibly can. How, I ask you, can you consistently admire both Daedalus and Diogenes? Tell me which of these two you would say was a wise man, the one who hit on the saw, or the one who, on seeing a boy drinking water from the hollow of his hand, immediately took the cup out of his knapsack and smashed it, telling himself off for his stupidity in having superfluous luggage about him all the time, and curled himself up in a jar and went to sleep. And today, just tell me which of the following you consider the wiser man. The one who discovers a means of spraying saffron perfumes to a tremendous height from hidden pipes, who fills or empties channels in one sudden rush of water, who constructs a set of interchangeable ceilings for a dining room in such a way as to produce a constant succession of different patterns, with a change of ceiling at each course? Or the one who proves to others and to himself that nature makes no demand on us that is difficult or hard to meet, and that we can live without the marble worker and the engineer, that we can clothe ourselves without importing silks, that we can have the things we need for our ordinary purposes if we will only be content with what the earth has made available on its surface. If they only cared to listen to this man, the human race would realize that cooks are as unnecessary to them as are soldiers. That race of men to whom taking care of the body was a straightforward enough matter were, if not philosophers, something very like it. The things that are essential are acquired with little bother. It is the luxuries that call for toil and effort. Follow nature and you will feel no need of craftsmen. It was nature's desire that we should not be kept occupied thus. She equipped for us everything she required us to contend with. But, quote, but the naked body can't stand cold. So what? Are the skins of wild beasts and other creatures not capable of giving us more than adequate protection against the cold? Is it not a fact that many peoples make a covering for their bodies out of bark? That feathers are sewn together to serve as clothing? That even today the majority of the Scythians wear the pelts of fox and mice, which are soft to the touch and impervious to wind? Are you going to tell me that any people you care to mention never used their hands to weave a basket-work of wattles, smear it all over with common mud, and then cover the whole roof with long grass stems and other material growing wild, and went through winter weather, the rain streaming down the slopes of the roof, without any worry? Quote, but we need some pretty dense shade to keep off the heat of the sun in summer. So what? Have past ages not left us plenty of hiding places that have been carved out by the ravages of time, or whatever other cause one cares to suppose, and have developed into caves? And again, is it not a fact that Circassian tribes take shelter in pits dug in the ground, as do other people who, because of extreme sun temperatures, find nothing less than the baked earth itself sufficiently substantial as a protective covering against the heat? When nature granted all the other animals a simple passage through life, she was not so unfair to man as to make it impossible for him alone, to live without all those skills. Nature demanded nothing hard from us, and nothing needs painful contriving to enable life to be kept going. We were born into a world in which things were ready to our hands. It is we who have made everything difficult to come by through our own disdain for what is easily come by. Shelter and apparel and the means of warming body and food, all the things which nowadays entails tremendous trouble, were there for the taking, free to all, obtainable at trifling effort. With everything the limit corresponded to the need. It is we and no one else who have made those same things costly, spectacular, and obtainable only by means of a large number of full-scale techniques. Nature suffices for all she asks of us. Luxury has turned her back on nature, daily urging herself on and growing through all the centuries, pressing men's intelligence into the development of the vices. First she began to hanker after things that were inessential, and then after things that were injurious, and finally she handed the mind over to the body and commanded it to be out-and-out slave of the body's whim and pleasure. All those trades that give rise to noise or hectic activity in the city are in business for the body, which was once in the position of the slave, having everything issued to it, and is now the master, having everything procured for it. This is the starting point for textile and engineering workshops, for the perfumes used by chefs, the sensual movements of our dancing teachers, even sensual and unmanly songs. And why? Because the bounds of nature, which set a limit to man's wants by relieving them only where there is necessity for such relief, have been lost sight of. To want simply what is enough nowadays suggests to people primitiveness and squalor. It is incredible, Lucilius, how easily even great men can be carried away from the truth by the sheer pleasure of holding forth on a subject. Look at Posidonius, in my opinion, one of those who have contributed most to philosophy, when he wants to give a description of how, in the first place, some threads are twisted and others drawn out from the soft, loose hank of wool. Then how the warp has its threads stretched perpendicularly by means of hanging weights, and how the weft, worked in to soften the hard texture of the warp threads which compress it on either side, is made compact and close by means of the batten. He declares that philosophers invented the art of the weaver too, forgetting that philosophers had disappeared by the time this comparatively advanced type of weaving in which, quote, the warp is bound to the beam and then its threads are parted by the reed, the woof worked in, between with pointed shuttles and pressed home by the broad comb's fretted teeth, end quote, had been evolved. He might have thought differently if he had only the opportunity of seeing the looms of the present day, the end product of which is clothing, which is not going to conceal a thing. Clothing which is no help to modesty, let alone the body. He then goes on to farmers and gives an equally eloquent description of how the soil is broken up by the plow for the first time and then gone over again in order that the earth thus loosened may allow the roots more room to develop, and continues with the sowing of the seeds and the lifting of the weeds to prevent any stray wild plants springing up and ruining the crop. All this, too, he represents as being the work of philosophers, as if agriculturists were not, now as ever, discovering plenty of new methods of increasing the soil's productivity. All right, we will continue there tomorrow. I was thinking about today what it means to have a moral framework for oneself. What it means to abide by a morality, a moral rule. What does that mean? Necessarily means you're restricting your behavior. It necessarily means you're choosing not to do things that you would otherwise do. It almost by definition means that to follow a moral rule, you're restricting yourself from doing something that may benefit you in the short term for the end of having a better long-term outcome for yourself or someone else, like your family or children. So, in making a decision to follow a moral rule, especially in the face of resistance, you're necessarily making things harder on yourself. You're taking risks that you would not have otherwise taken. And I feel like that needs to be sold up front as part of the discussion and not something that people just sort of like back into. Like, it seems like people are taught the moral rules and then later they realize, oh, well, following this is going to require me, risking my career or, endangering myself potentially, depending on the moral rule and the time in history we're talking about. And so they're sort of left in the lurch at the last moment, realizing the full effects, the full commitment required to a moral rule. I think it would be useful for people to have this stuff, talked about up front. Like, hey, abiding any moral framework, choosing to elevate yourself out of the state of nature as a beast is going to come with it some disadvantages that you need to be prepared for so that you're able to handle them and mitigate them better in the moment when they arise. All right, guys, have a great day.